I'm joined by Alex Jan, non-exec chair at B Midtown, former chief economist at Arup and member of the Mayor's Infrastructure Advisory Group. Hi, Alex.
Morning, Amy. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Yes, not bad, thank you. Not bad. Bearing up.
Well, thank you for joining me. I'm really looking forward to getting your insights and your view on our theme this month, the polycentric city. Here we are. We're pretty much a year into the COVID-19 pandemic. The 15-minute city is a real buzz phrase right now, and many commentators are saying that major city centres and areas of dense employment in cities such as London and Paris and New York are on the way out. Do you agree with this critique, Alex?
Well, I think it's certainly true to say that cities with a high degree of dependency on public transport, high density, have been badly affected by the pandemic. I think initially there was quite a lot of concern that density and high dependency on the public transport systems was in some way responsible for spreading COVID more easily than would otherwise have been the case. The amount of conjecture there's been over how this thing has spread and all the rest of it has been quite significant. And in a way, if people's perception is that places like London are more risky from a COVID perspective, then that appears to have been a significant factor in affecting the way in which these world cities have performed. I mean, what I would say is that I think there's every possibility that as we come out of COVID and confidence returns, that we will see these big centres, these important centres, starts to recover as they have in the past. There was the Hong Kong flu of 1969, which everybody's kind of forgotten. I had to look it up to find out what it was, which knocked out a lot of cities and indeed European workforces. There have been, we obviously had the Second World War in which London was bombed. There's been plagues, pestilence, perhaps not famine, but I think the real question is not whether or not London and New York, Tokyo, Paris will survive, but how long will they take to recover? And I think that's the really crucial question in this equation.
Would you agree London has a record of being hit harder by this sort of crisis, but quicker recovery?
Yes, I mean, the evidence from previous recessions that some of us have been fortunate enough to live through is that London tends to adjust most quickly and then recover, in a way which is more profound. I mean, I would say that's probably certainly the experience since the 1980s, when London's population started to grow for the first time since the war, actually. I think that what's interesting about the pandemic is that in parts of London, the unemployment levels are actually higher than the rest of the country, which perhaps reflects that hypothesis that, London gets hit hardest and then will recover most quickly. And some of the poorest parts of London have suffered the most. And when we talk about levelling up and the north-south divide and everything, it's actually probably very important to be mindful of the real hardship that many parts of London is facing. I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is that London's private sector is a much bigger part of its economy than the national average, or certainly was pre-COVID. And that in a way means that it's less dependent on the state in terms of if there's, for example, austerity or cutbacks in public expenditure. And that's arguably helped with its natural resilience. Given the phenomena of COVID and the huge role that the state has had to play, or felt it's needed to play, in terms of pumping money into households and businesses to try and stabilize things, it's probably too early to know if London's going to follow a natural or a typical recovery curve compared to its previous performance since the 1980s during recessions and economic challenges.
Yeah, interesting. And and clearly the private sector is going to have a big role to play in that. You touched on London's population, and I've heard quoted a lot recently, a 700,000 figure drop in London's population over the last year. Do you have any predictions for London's migration patterns and population over the next few years, and what impact do you think that will have?
Well, I mean, who knows? The honest answer is nobody really knows. I think what I would say, Amy, is that the figure of 700,000, which I've heard in the media, my gut instinct is that that sounds as if it's slightly on the high side. And the reason I say that is for a couple of reasons. I mean, London's population is around 9 million at the moment. So, reduction of 700,000 would, by my maths, get this wrong, won't I? But it's probably between 7 and 8%. And that's that would be a very significant fall. I think that, so my instinct is that that's an overestimation. I think, and there are a number of reasons for saying that. One is that although many people will have left London, those people who've left will have been offset by, by others coming back to the city. There will be a natural rebalancing in terms of reasons people have left to go home, for example, and reasons for people coming back to the city, such as to return home during the pandemic. The other factor in the equation is, of course, that students make up a very significant proportion of London's population. I mean, it's in the hundreds of thousands. So quite how those numbers will play out as restrictions hopefully lifted rather, I think is yet to be seen. There could be quite a strong bounce back there. There's obviously also the Brexit factor in the equation, that we don't really know to what extent the population changes this year have been driven by EU nationals leaving. So it's a bit early to tell, but my hunch is that it sounds like an overestimation. And some people, I'm not saying who necessarily, but some people may have kind of been wanting to will those larger figures on London because they kind of see it as part of as a sort of positive sign in terms of a broader agenda for the country and indeed immigration. But I think that's for them to account for, really.
Yeah. And at NLA, we're often discussing the benefits of a future London that has well-connected mixed-use neighbourhoods linked and supported to a strong centre. And I'm really interested to get your view on this relationship between central London and the outer town centres and districts. Do you think it's possible for our wider London town centres to thrive alongside the central activity zone?
Well, it's a question which has been preoccupying planners and economists and others ever since the 1940s, really, when the famous Abercrombie plan for London envisaged sort of strengthening and creating these regional, if you like, these London regional centres of industrial and other forms of economic activity. And indeed, we saw post-war the movement of lots of people from inner London to outer London and indeed beyond for very honourable, understandable reasons around improvements in housing and so forth. A few observations, really. I think one is that I'm struck by the extent to which policymakers, particularly at a national level, appear to have just sort of taken a wait and see approach to the central activity zone. And by that, I really mean the Zone 1 area of central London and the Northern Isle of Dogs. I mean, between them, they account for something like 1.9 million jobs and about 11% of total UK output. And in that sense, you'd have kind of hoped that government would have been concerned to think about a set of policies which were designed to maintain and protect and enhance what we call the CAS plus, that central activity zone. And I'm just struck by the extent to which there's been what I would call a sort of wait and see approach. I think policy drift is how some might describe it. Now, aiming off of that, to answer your question, there's two thoughts really. One is, how will, in terms of how will central London and those outer London centres of employment, you know, the Croydons, the Heathrows, the Stratfords and others fare. So it's very early days, but you can see a scenario in which, you know, the parallel I would draw is with the airports really. If there is a downward pressure on demand for employment in central London, if you think of central London as sort of the Heathrow airport of places to do business, you can imagine a world in which there'll be a shift of activity and investment into central London from some of those greater London regional centres as central London becomes more more affordable to many businesses, and their aspiration, a bit like Heathrow, would be to, you know, if you're an airline, the one place you'd like to fly from in London, and indeed the UK, is probably Heathrow, but because of cost pressures and other reasons, they're forced to fly from some of the other airports. So my analogy is that if Heathrow sees a reduction in demand, if central London sees a reduction in demand for office space and other things, then you might see a shifting into central London from some of those secondary centres because it's fundamentally the most attractive place to base your employment, even if it's in a world of 3 days a week and so forth. And we can talk about why that is, you know, in a minute, but it fundamentally comes down to the productivity gains that employers and employees are able to benefit from being located in the centre. And it's, for professional services, it's about a 20% productivity gain over you know, employees being more widely spaced. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is, you know, it will depend also on the extent to which employers believe that it's better to have a different approach to where their offices are. So from a risk management point of view, employers might say, we no longer want to have 3,000 or 4,000 people in the same site. We're going to sort of, you know, hedge our employment centres to give us more resilience in the case of something like COVID coming back, and that may or may not play out. But fundamentally, I think that with the right policies, central London has the potential to recover, to rebound, to sort of leverage this fundamental ability to offer a higher degree of productivity and workplace attractiveness to employees over the medium to long term. And in the context of 15-minute city, very, very briefly, you know, 15-minute city is great, particularly for residents, but a 15-minute city approach would damage central London, you know, very significantly, because it's not a 15-minute city for by virtue of its connectivity. Central London is a place that people commute for 45 minutes or an hour to get to. So we have to be careful what we wish for when we talk about the 15-minute city. I think it's fine for some of those outer areas, but in terms of the productivity and attractiveness of central London, it needs to be more than that. And, you know, schemes like Crossrail and Thameslink actually give central London the ability to not be 15-minute and to be sustainable and attractive to employers and employees.
So interesting. And with all this in mind, what policies do you think we need to be putting in place to allow both central London and other economic centres to thrive?
So the good news is we now have, we're inching towards, I think, the adoption of our new London plan, which I think, as others have said, will provide a degree of certainty and stability in allowing investment to take place. So that's one good thing. I think we need to explicitly recognise that there are certain clusters in central London, such as around, you know, some of them are in my business improvement district, which is Holborn, Clerkenwell, Farringdon and Bloomsbury, such as around the arts, the cultures, the museums. I think we need to recognise that those sectors are, you know, they only can really exist as clusters. You can't sustain them if you spread them very, you know, to the four corners of London or indeed the economy. And that's not to say there shouldn't be other clusters, but I think we need to explicitly acknowledge the importance of those sectors alongside the financial services, which kind of didn't get a mention in the Brexit negotiations, and other professional services around law, my background in consulting and so forth. So we need to recognize those clusters and think through policies which are designed to help them to grow and prosper. That might take the form of further government support, which, you know, is a tough thing to ask at the moment, given all the other demands on government's resources. But certainly things like business rate reform, further delays and concessions in terms of VAT and so forth, I think is important. And I'd also say, Amy, that we need, you know, our central London local authorities to take a more positive view of proposals for growth and investment. And I know that's always a balancing act, particularly with residential needs. And, you know, I'm one of them. I live in central London, I'm lucky enough to live here. And I know it's a balancing act. But let's see policies and planning philosophies which are designed to support and encourage growth and sustain these important clusters rather than do the opposite to them. And, you know, things like the VAT change for overseas visitors next door to my BID area in the West End area, you know, Jason and the new West End company gang are desperate to try and get the government to reverse its proposed removal of the tax perk for those who are visiting London from overseas in terms of VAT and duty. So there are a number of things we should be doing, and there are a number of things we shouldn't be doing. And those are the sorts of things that come to mind. And finally, on public transport, I think we need a sort of very grown-up, mature settlement between central government, City Hall and TfL on financing and funding its stability. And you know, through the stability package that has been put together by TfL. And we need to make the most of Crossrail, which is due to open next year, which I think will bring another 1 million people within 45 minutes of central London. So although it's late, maybe fortuitously we can use its late opening to provide a fantastic vehicle, literally, to encourage safe movement back into central London, to boost employment and growth and productivity once again.
Alex, so many interesting insights in there. Thank you so much for your call to action and positive sentiments at the end there. It's been great speaking to you.
Thanks, Amy. It's been a real pleasure talking to you too.